Hi all and welcome back to my channel, and today we are going to be reviewing one of my most anticipated Android phones of the year, the Motorola RAZR 40 Ultra, otherwise known as the RAZR Plus in America, which just seems a bit confusing to me, but I guess that's just another example of the American division of Motorola being a little bit strange, just like the decision of not releasing the RAZR 2022 there at all. Despite what Motorola America might have thought of the phone, I personally believe that the 2022 RAZR was quite possibly one of the most criminally underrated phones of the year. That's a great screen, isn't it? It was finally a flip phone without many of the compromises that you expect from the competition, namely Samsung. And this new version that I've got over here has suddenly made the old phone feel absolutely ancient. And that's not something that you really see with new releases these days, is it? And while it does solve a lot of the issues that I had with the old phone, they have gone backwards in some very bizarre ways as well that I will get to later. And this is important because competition in this flip phone segment is absolutely fierce. Earlier this year we saw the Oppo Find N2 Flip, which was absolutely gorgeous, but it had a very underutilized cover display. And we've just seen the newly unveiled Samsung Galaxy Flip 5, arguably the segment leader. Surprisingly though, Samsung has taken a few cues, namely the Hinge design and also the cover display from this Motorola. So this really does need to be good to steal any sales from Samsung. So does the new RAZR still deserve your money? Let's find out. If you want to see more phone reviews like this one, be sure to like and subscribe, and be sure to leave any questions about the phone that you might have in the comment section, and I'll try to get to them as quickly as I can. So the RAZR, while it was the first flip phone of this form factor back in 2019, it's always been lagging in both sales and mindshare behind the Samsung Galaxy Flip that is now in its 5th generation now. While the first two RAZRs delighted with their retro designs, the middling specs and higher prices really did see sales trail behind the Samsung. And just when we thought that they had a smash hit with last year's model, it was limited to China to begin with, and it was only after much begging that they finally decided to release it in the West, albeit only in the EU and Australia. What especially stood out with the modern RAZRs were the outer displays for me. Not only were these large enough to easily frame up a selfie, but they were also capacious enough to respond to notifications, to watch videos, or even run full applications. And they've really taken it to the next level with this year's model, namely with the front display. It's actually so large that it wraps around the camera module. It really is quite a sight to behold. It seems, however, that Samsung has had the same idea, making the cover display as large as it possibly could be. So let's get a picture of that Samsung up, and as you can see, despite the Samsung releasing after the Motorola, it looks very last year in comparison. They decided to shape the screen just above the cameras instead of wrapping around the camera units. But enough about the Samsung, let's compare this year's Motorola with the previous version. So it's fair to say that the 2022 RAZR wasn't exactly a looker. I mean, that's half the point of a flip phone, so I guess that was a bit of a problem. Let's take a look at it. Not only was it only available in this one very boring color, black, but its blobby shape, matte finishes especially on the sides, really ugly camera bump design, thick bezels, and unrefined hinge design. It just makes it look a bit cheaper than it really should have been. The 2.7-inch cover screen, despite being the largest of any flip phone when it came out, also looked rather pathetic in the space that it resided within. There was no wireless charging as well, and the buttons on the side here were way too small and easy to press. I literally almost always accidentally just pressed the power button, which was very annoying. And also, let's not forget that it was kind of thick. I mean, it's all pretty much nitpicking, but yeah, it wasn't as pretty as it should have been, especially when the Samsung and the Oppo were both drop dead gorgeous. The new one luckily seems to have taken a little bit of inspiration from the competition. Firstly, it's a lot narrower than the old version, which makes it a lot easier to hold. And to be fair, I'm not exactly sure about that decision. I mean, yes, it is nicer to hold than the old one, as the old one was a little too wide to hold for comfort, especially with my small hands. But when you open the phones up, the screen looks so tall and skinny that it's almost ridiculous. On a nicer note though, the mirror-like finish finish on the front screen really looks fantastic. The subtle and tasteful camera design is also a massive improvement over the old one. I really do love the contrast polished bar on the back over here, the rounded shiny stainless steel frame and the cleaned up hinge also all work together really nicely to present quite a positive visual impression, especially compared to the old one. If we just pop them side by side like that, you definitely know which device is prettier. And the new phone is even more gorgeous in either of the other hues that are offered. Man, I wish I could have been lent one of them. But this black version is gorgeous as well, especially when the cover display is on. And I just can't describe just how cool the cover display looks here. It almost feels like that iPhone 10 moment where we were seeing tiny bezels on a mainstream phone for the very first time. When you are using this phone in public, people really do notice, and while the new Samsung does get close to this, it really doesn't hold a candle to this RAZR design. Now let's look at the specs. A lot of people have noted that this front display is far higher resolution than the Samsung's front display at 1056 by 1066 versus 720 by 748, but what you probably haven't heard is that this one is 144 Hz, which means that it feels amazing to use, unlike the Samsung, and also unlike the old RAZR, which are both stuck at 60 Hz, which just makes the cover screen experience feel like a poor relation to the super smooth 144 Hz of the inner display of the old one and 165 of this new version. The new screen, especially compared to the old one, just works like butter, and the 3.6-inch display here just feels amazing to use, and it reaches almost 1000 nits as well, compared to 300 nits of the old one, which means that the new one is just plenty bright to use outdoors despite the mirror-like finish. Just using these two phones back to back, it's pretty amazing how much the experience has changed in just one generation. It almost feels like a monumental improvement. So while the hardware is amazing, the software unfortunately could use a little bit of work, but we'll come back to that later. On the side of the device, a bit like the old one, we still have the volume buttons and the fingerprint all on the same side. It's a little bit confusing to use. I would have preferred if the volume buttons were on the opposite side, and unfortunately the power button is still far too easy to accidentally press. When we open the phone up, we can see that it's still got a water droplet style hinge like the old one, and the hinge is quite a good design. The very wide radius means that not only is the screen less likely to crack, but the crease is still far smaller than even the new Samsung, from early reports at least. And if you can see the comparison over here, they've also cleaned up the hinge design as well. I was constantly picking out lint from the inside of the hinge of the old phone, but with the new one it looks a bit like the Oppo, and that won't be a problem whatsoever. One slight problem is it feels just a little bit sticky to use, but it might just be because this is not a new unit and something disastrous might have happened to the phone with the previous reviewer. On a good note though, the hinge does stand up at a variety of angles quite nicely, and there's far less wobble as well as compared to the old one. The old hinge was a little bit wobbly, but that wasn't a real concern really. The inner screen is a 6.9-inch OLED that's 1080p, and it reaches a whopping 165 Hz, which is a lot. Honestly, it feels so smooth and quite incredible to use. And despite sounding larger than the last year's phone, which was 6.7 inches, it actually is a little bit smaller because of the unusually tall aspect ratio. And therefore it does feel a little bit claustrophobic if you are used to a bigger phone like the old one. And while the display does look great and it's pretty high quality, it isn't quite as bright as something like an iPhone 14 Pro. This only reaches roughly 1000 nits and the iPhone reaches 2000 nits. So if you're using it in direct sunlight outside, it's not quite as pleasant to use, but still more than bright enough for most people. The new phone is also incredibly thin. It's just 7mm in thickness when open and 15mm when folded. And it also just weighs at just over 180 grams, which is pretty light in this day and age. One of the trade-offs though is with the speakers, which is considerably quieter and poorer quality than last year's phone. And it does does lag considerably behind a slab-style phone like the iPhone. And the other trade-off, as you might expect, is battery size. So while it is surprisingly actually larger than last year's phone had only 3,500 milliamps, the new phone has 3,800 milliamps, which is smaller than a traditional phone, but still larger than some other foldables. Despite this, battery life has actually been pretty good. That may have been because the cover display is simply so large that I tend to spend most of my time just using this. If battery is your concern, then I don't think this foldable should put you off. One odd choice though is the processor, because it has the same Snapdragon Series 8 Gen 1 chip as last year's phone, and while it is a great chip, it is a year old, and the new processor, the Gen 2, is both more powerful and more battery efficient. At least it is still more powerful than the MediaTek units that you find in the Oppo phone. But again, it does trail in performance to the Samsung, which has the new processor. And I'm also slightly disappointed that in Australia at least, we are limited to just the 256 gigabytes of storage option. While that's plenty for most people, I would have liked to see the option of 512 in this day and age. Okay, so this phone is absolutely gorgeous, which is great, but how is it like to use? And I would like to say it's quite impressive, but you just have to accept a little bit of jankiness on the front display. Firstly, like last year's phone, there is no always on display on the front, which is absolutely insane because of the competition, which both have it. But it's just something that you have to accept with Motorola products, because I don't think any Motorola/Lenovo product has an always on display at the moment. And in its place, we have a clock that either turns on when you raise the phone or when you tap on the screen, a little bit like the original Apple Watch. But ultimately, the screen will go back to sleep, which sucks. And while you do have a number of options for clocks over here, none of these quite match the cuteness that you find on the Oppo phone that we saw earlier this year. And while they're fine, you can see that they try to be cute with this particular one. They're just not quite as good as what we found on the Oppo phone. Once you unlock the phone with a fingerprint sensor though, which works quite well on the power button on the side, you are taken to a sort of mini home screen where you've got some widgets on the top which look fine, and you've also got some shortcuts on the bottom that take you to your various panels that are all customizable. Before I go on, I do have to say, please Motorola, you've got some great looking live backgrounds, like this one is quite cool, and when you open it, it animates as well. But can you please make them in a higher refresh rate, because it's quite jarring to be going from 165 Hz animation to something that's a lot lower in the stuttery live wallpaper. Anyway, so you can swipe down from the top of the display like so to see your control center, or whatever Android calls it. You can tap on this little icon over here to see all your notifications. That's all actionable as well, as you might expect on any normal phone. And finally, you can tap on the battery icon over here to see your battery in more detail. As you can see, I've got 86%. What you also have are your traditional Android gestures, so you can swipe up to see your recently used apps, like, you know, Instagram over here. If we go into someone's profile, like Busted, you've got your traditional back gestures as well, which work fantastically. And if we go back home, let's take a look at some of your panels. So you've got panels like your app drawer. You can add and disable apps that can run on the front screen. You've got your contacts as well. You've got a little bit of a calendar as well. You've got your weather. And we've got one for your games as well, and also some news. These are all adjustable, and you can add and delete them as you like. Now, this seems all quite typical, but what makes the Motorola stand out is the fact that, like last year, you can run just about any app you like. Let's remind us what that was like last year. So last year we only had the 2.7-inch display, but you could open up YouTube and watch a video like so. That works quite nicely. You could also, let's say, run Twitter. The screen size is not ideal, but it's all possible, as you can see. With the new one, we've got the same idea. So over here, you can add apps to your app drawer that can run on the front screen, and this is the reason why you'd want to choose Motorola in this particular class of phone. While the new Samsung does have some level of functionality, it requires app developers to specifically allow their apps to run on the front display, and I assume that that will be very much a little bit of an uphill battle, but I might stand corrected. I hear that currently there's only 5 apps that are compatible with the front display, and you can't even use Google Wallet, which just sounds insane to me. And if you compare that with the Motorola, where you can run just about any app, it's just insane. So if we open up an app like the recording app, for instance, by default apps run in a windowed mode, which cuts right above the cameras. Let's take a look at that in another app. As you can see, you get a lovely large display, and it's not bad at all. This is the sort of experience that you might get on the Samsung phone if apps were to run. In this particular mode, you can still see your notifications on the bottom, you can still see your battery level, and this is perfect, I found, for watching videos on. For example, let's watch some YouTube. We've got a lovely review of a Jaguar X-Type, and as you can see, it looks absolutely fantastic. I have to be honest, I've spent hours watching Netflix like this on the go, on public transport, when I'm walking around. It really is quite fantastic. It sort of reminds me of watching videos on an old phone like the original iPhone. It's that sort of screen size that you get. Apps like Google Maps and messaging apps also work great, and I'm also glad to say that the keyboard is far larger and easier to use than the keyboard on last year's phone. However, there is one major problem, and it's the fact that Android apps just don't like working on a horizontal or squarish display. It honestly reminds me of when I was using a BlackBerry Q10, which had a square screen. I mean, let's take a look at Instagram, for example. It just looks ridiculous. It's like staring through a letterbox. And let's take a look at TikTok. Hi Ramal. As you can see, it looks absolutely ridiculous. This sort of aspect ratio is fine for some apps, but for the majority of the ones you actually want to use, you can see that it's a little bit dire. So what you can actually do is expand the display. So what you do is go into multitasking and you press full screen. And as you can see, this is far better. Apps look absolutely gorgeous when you use it like this. Let's go back to Instagram. As you can see, that is far better. Except there is a slight problem. On the bottom right portion of the display, as you can see, the cameras are blocking these 2 buttons over here, so you can't press on anything. I honestly wish that the cameras were oriented vertically, like on the Oppo phone, or perhaps closer to the top of the phone, so there will be less of a compromise over here. Luckily, however, I have found that it's quite easy to switch into normal view to access such buttons, and luckily the Facebook app has its toolbar on the top, so I've been browsing a lot of Facebook like a retiree recently. But for apps like Instagram or X, the taskbar on the bottom just is not ideal for this sort of situation, but the apps really do look fantastic, and I've spent so many hours just scrolling like this. This is something that you absolutely cannot do on the Galaxy Flip just yet, at least. I feel that a screen like the Oppo Find N2's one, while smaller, might have been a little bit better for usability as it is oriented vertically, like how most Android apps are made to operate. Perhaps a workaround would be to sort of letterbox the screen vertically rather than horizontally. But you know what, despite the issues, I absolutely love this front display. It's so good that I honestly am finding that I'm using the front display here more than actually using the inside one. It's just so smooth and slick, and I love holding a phone that is of this particular size. This front display is so good that I'm going to go as far as to say that this display is the reason why you should get this phone instead of other foldables, especially compared to the Oppo and also what I've seen of the Flip 5 so far. But how is the rest of the phone? Well, that is a little bit less impressive. While I did complain that last year's phone was a little bit too wide to hold comfortably, it's sort of the same width of an iPhone Pro Max. At least it meant that it had quite a normal aspect ratio. Everything looks pretty reasonable on this screen. And it also did like quite the distinctive curved top and bottom parts of the display as well. That was kind of cool. And while this new phone is definitely easier to hold, it just feels a little bit silly to have this much vertical space on a phone. But again, this is exactly how the competition looks right now. And I also just can't get past how the Hinge sounds. It really sounds like that there's a little bit of a rattle here. Maybe it's just this unit, but that definitely was not here with last year's phone. I've been using this for a year almost now, and it still feels fantastic. The case, while it does look smaller than last year's phone over here, I have been using this phone for a little while, and creases do tend to get larger over time. But at least it is far more subtle than what we are seeing on Samsung's new phone from the previews that I've seen. Otherwise, the phone's performance, despite having last year's Snapdragon Series 8 Gen 1, is really quite fantastic. There's nothing to fault here. The quality of the display is quite enviable too, and the 1000 nits of brightness, while it isn't class leading, isn't too shabby at all. And Android 13 overall just runs fantastically, as you expect. It's just a really solid Android 13 experience that's super smooth and fluid. The Motorola improvements include the classic double twist to turn on the camera, and this is honestly something that I miss tremendously whenever I use a non-Motorola phone. What's pretty great too is that Motorola is promising 3 years worth of updates, which is better than the previous 2, and it also includes Ready For, which is Motorola's way of turning your phone into a desktop when pairing it with the display. But on the RAZR at least, it only works wirelessly and not with a cable, so it's a little bit laggy. But at least it's better than not having Samsung's solution of not having DeX on any of the foldables whatsoever. And now we come to perhaps the most contentious issue, the camera. And this is one area that's actually gone backwards. Okay, yes, being able to use your main camera as the viewfinder is still very cool. This is still the best viewfinder in the business, and it's really great to use. And also the smile animation when you are taking images of other people is just as adorable as it was last year. But the camera is actually worse than the unit that was on last year's phone. Last year we had a 50 megapixel 1 in 1.55 inch sensor, and it took some surprisingly good images, really good for a foldable. And the new sensor, on the other hand, is just a 12 megapixel 1 in 2.55 inch sensor, which is considerably smaller. It's almost like going from an iPhone 13 Pro to an iPhone 10. And I can see why they did this. If we take a look at the two camera bumps, the new one is considerably smaller and far more attractive than the one from last year. And the competition, especially from Samsung, is not exactly putting up much of a fight. This year's camera is exactly the same as last year's, which was roughly the same as the year before. However, despite the massive spec difference, the results are actually surprisingly close. While there perhaps is a little bit less detail, and perhaps you can't zoom in quite as far into the images before, the results are surprisingly similar. Maybe this just goes to show how little having 50 megapixels on the old camera actually mattered on still a relatively small sensor. I would actually argue that the colors in images overall look a little bit nicer on the new camera. However, there is considerably less shallow depth of field, and the smaller sensor also does make itself a little bit known in poorer lit situations. So while the hardware may be a major downgrade, in practice the change is actually barely perceptible for most people. The wide camera hasn't changed from my understanding, and while it wasn't great before, it does seem to have some updated processing and looks somewhat better, but still not fantastic. And as expected, there's still no optical stabilization, so videos can be a little bit shaky when you're walking around, but it's quite smooth otherwise through a software stabilization solution. So while the camera, like on all flip phones, isn't fantastic, and also despite a hardware downgrade, the camera isn't that bad at all. And also, just to add some random notes to the end of this review, the vibration motor is still fantastic, just like last year, much better than the Think phone that I tried earlier in the year. And there's also finally wireless charging, unlike the old one. It's very slow, but at least it's here. And also at 1,500 Australian dollars, it is a relative bargain. It's $150 cheaper than the Samsung device, I believe. So in conclusion, is the Motorola RAZR 40 Ultra a flawed device? Yes, of course it is. All foldables are. If you want a great, reliable smartphone with no quirks, then just get a normal slab phone. but what this is quite possibly the most fun I've had on a phone this year. I've enjoyed my time with this phone more than just about anything else, apart from maybe the projector phone. This is a phone for people who just want the absolute latest and greatest phone with a wow factor, with features that just make it a little bit different, a little bit more quirky. And this just really isn't like any other phone. It's a bit of a statement piece. If you want this phone, then there really is no substitute. And for now, this is the flip phone to get. So if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. Remember that you can ask me anything that you'd like to know about this phone in the comments. And until next time, toodaloo.